Thanks, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here to represent small town USA. Because remember, most of law enforcement in the U.S. is done by small agencies. I want to give you some idea of the size of our agency and the jurisdiction we serve. There we are in the red. That's Maryland. We're one of 23 counties. Baltimore City is that little square thing. We hang off there. We kind of look like a body louse hanging off the bottom of Baltimore City. Anne Arundel County. Population of the county is a little over 500,000 people. And it's a big county. There's 23 counties in Maryland, and geographically they're pretty large size, 600 square miles. And the police department has 700 sworn members, 250 civilians. Now, I say this because we're not Mayberry. We're not that small. And for those of you under 40, which is most of you in the room, Mayberry was a TV show with Andy Griffith and Barney Fife, and they kind of made fun of law enforcement a little bit. And I'm going to tell a quick story about that. Probably about 15 years ago, up in Baltimore City, in downtown Baltimore City, there was a gang of 3 robbing banks. And they hit a bank every day, sometimes 2 banks, right in downtown. And for some reason, they decided to come down to our county and start that. We caught them. And during the interrogation, our detectives working with the FBI, and what happened in Baltimore City, of course, they inundated the downtown area with tactical patrol, and that's why they left. So during the interrogation, they were asking this one suspect, so why'd you go to Anne Arundel County? And he said, oh, it was too many police. Now, that's Baltimoreese, and that means police. Police. So we decided to go to Mayberry. Now, that really hurts your feelings when bank robbers make fun of you like that. I haven't quite gotten over it. That was 15 years ago, but I will. Some of the crime statistics from our county: 15 murders. How we hang off the bottom of Baltimore with D.C. to our south and have 15 murders, I don't know. I think we had 22 last year, but it's been the average since I've been there since 1985, about 15 a year. 100 rapes. These are rapes with sexual assault kits and some sort of evidence recovery, rather than just reported rapes. And from the Uniform Crime Report, 2,500 Part 1 violent crimes and 15,000 Part 1 property crimes. Now, let's describe our organization a little bit. We have a crime lab separate from what I supervise, and they have 5 CDS analysts. And we have a small serology DNA unit, 2 persons. I supervise the identification crime scene unit. We have 12 crime scene techs, 24-hour coverage. It's all civilianized. And they go out, process anything from burglaries up to and including homicides, of course. This is our case managers. We have 2 evidence coordinators. And I think home office does it this way. But what they do is they occasionally respond to crime scenes because they're cross-trained in footwear, tire tread, and blood spatter analysis. But generally what they do is quarterback or manage the cases. They decide what evidence has been collected and what lab is going to go to. The only thing we have in-house is DNA, and of course we do our own footwear, tire tread, and blood spatter stuff. But they're the ones that run the cases from A to Z and decide we're going to go to the FBI lab, the Maryland State Police lab, whatever entity we're going to use. And we also use private labs too and pay. Latent print unit and the photo lab is under. So that's how we're set up. We're kind of fractured. We don't have a unified forensic science section. We're broken up in these two entities. The evidence coordinator job actually came about from me, because when I started there, I handled all the homicides for about 5 years. So I went to every homicide scene, did all the evidence collection, and then since we had no lab then, except for CDS analysis, I got everything off to the lab where it belonged to get it analyzed. Some of the stuff that comes into our decision about how we're going to examine trace evidence or what we're going to examine, to trace or not to trace, that is the question. And the evidence coordinators are the ones that decide this, and it's based upon a lot of factors. Here are just some of them. What kind of physical evidence is there? Is there stuff like pubic hair combings that are intrinsically trace evidence? Is it clothing? What kind of crime is it? Is it a street shooting? All those factors come into play as to what kind of physical evidence there is and what we're going to have examined. Is there a suspect or not? And I'll elaborate a little more on that. But is the suspect in custody? It does make a difference, and again, it's a variety of factors, but is the suspect in custody, and is it a recent arrest? Has the suspect been arrested within a couple hours of, say, a sexual assault? We have a whole protocol for doing a suspect sexual kit where we swab penises, do pubic hair combings, the whole 9 yards. So that depends, and of course, and that stuff will usually lend itself to trace or DNA. And if there is no suspect, our initial emphasis is going to be on database stuff. We're going to do our best, fingerprints and DNA. We have no idea who it is, it's a whodunit. So this is the stuff we're going to look at to see if we can identify the perpetrator. And that really becomes an issue of, are we identifying the perpetrator, hopefully? Or is it just case enhancement? Somebody has been arrested, there are witness statements or something else that has led to that arrest. What kind of cases are against this person, and how far are we going to go with our examinations? And Faye Springer said it yesterday. I mean, juries expect you to do everything in every case, but when we're looking at trace evidence, we're looking at all the other factors to decide whether or not we're going to do trace analysis, or have a trace analysis done, I should say. Relationships are important. A husband kills the wife, even if the jury is expecting, because of one of those TV shows, us to do everything and analyze the hairs and fibers, the relationship excludes that possibility, so we're just not going to do it. Stranger to stranger crimes are another story altogether. Now, this might not be the best setting for this, but I'm going to, in some regards, call this opening Pandora's box. And I'm speaking of not the evanescent kind of trace evidence, I'm speaking of the durable stuff, like hairs especially, because they can be individualized. Sometimes we've gone down that road to take a look at our tape list from the vehicle or our vacuumings. And what do we find in there? Oh, we find OJ's hair. We find maybe my hair. We find everybody but the suspects. So what have we done? We set the table for day one of the defense. We've got plenty of red herrings for them to put on. And so we carefully consider that before we start down the road. Are we going to do trace analysis in this case? What else do we have? In the history, and I'll go over the history in a minute, but when we have the most probative results, I've been there since 1985. When was that? When trace evidence was considered during the initial laboratory screening and has equal footing with DNA. When we had evidence that went into our lab system, because there was a time when we had a trace examiner, and when that evidence was looked at by a DNA person and a trace person simultaneously, we had tremendous results. Trace evidence all the time in cases. We don't have that anymore because we lost our trace examiner, and I'll talk about that in a minute, about our history. The least probative results, again, during my tenure there since 1985, is when trace evidence is considered secondarily, and that's what we do now. We have evolved or devolved to this point that now we're looking at things, and we only do trace, sometimes, not always, if we don't have anything else, if the DNA didn't work out, if we don't have any latent fingerprints. That's a horrible way to do it, but that's what we've come to. And this is why. Here's our history since 1985. From 1985 through the early 1990s, the Maryland State Police Crime Lab and FBI lab we used. And it was a good time. We got really great results. Of course, very early on, DNA wasn't around. But we would submit our evidence comprehensively to one of these laboratories, and they would look at it, either conventional serology and trace at the same time. I can remember getting results from, say, 1986 from Maryland State Police Crime Lab, submit a rape victim's clothes, and get a call from the lab and say, the victim had been abducted, couldn't identify at all the suspect, even the race of the suspect. And I can remember getting a call from the Maryland State Police Crime Lab. Terry Long, who's the deputy director there now, used to do both trace and serology. She was cross-trained in both. And she called and said, we've got some maroon carpet fibers all over the victim's pants, and we got a Caucasian pubic hair that's not hers. And sure enough, a week later, we get a suspect driving a maroon Grand Prix with maroon interior, and she even did a PG, I'm talking old days now, a PGM on the root of that pubic hair, and the carpet fibers were consistent from his car. So it was a good time. We got a lot of investigative leads out of trace evidence then. We don't now because we're always backfilling with it. Then in the mid-90s, we had our own trace unit. Dave Exline was our trace unit. So when Dave was looking at the incoming case, and we had our DNA guy looking at the incoming case, really good results. What happened? Dave left. We had a vacancy, and one-man DNA shows were sort of over with, so that position was filled with a DNA person, and it's never been visited again as to getting trace back. And currently we outsource. We don't have a comprehensive way to look at all our trace evidence. So we do, if it's at a last resort or however we do it, we send it to Dave. It works at R.J. Lee, and now we pay him out of our pocket to look at the stuff he used to look at, well, kind of for free, not really for free. How is trace viewed in our system? Start with the crime lab. The emphasis is on DNA. We have 2 DNA analysts, and that's what they look for, DNA. When they screen his clothing, they're looking for DNA. They do cultivations, but they don't even describe what if it's hairs and fibers, what's been gathered. And right now, there are no plans to bring back trace. I know if our crime lab director had another warm body, it would be another DNA person because the backlog exists. It's significant, and backlogs seem to drive what we do in crime labs. Investigators, how do they view trace in our agency? Well, they prefer database stuff. They love when you can call them up and say, got a fingerprint, or we have DNA, and here's who you need to go arrest. They just kind of love that, and that's human nature. I understand that. One of the things I have noticed in all my years with Anne Arundel County, initially, we had a hard time getting detectives to quit canvassing the neighborhood and to pay attention that, hey, we've got this hair that is consistent with the suspect's hair. They didn't seem to care about it too much. Now, they don't canvass neighborhoods as much as they do wait outside to see what kind of results wait outside the lab to see what kind of results we're going to get to them. It's really come full circle now. Prosecutors, initially, because we had a couple of the first DNA cases in Maryland, and I can remember initially the prosecutors saying, all you have is this DNA. Don't you have a hair or a fiber or anything like that? Just DNA? Oh, God. They really did. And then they embraced DNA. So now you don't have DNA and you want to go forward with this case, even though you've got hairs and fibers? I think the jury's expectations, because of that show, or those shows, are shifting us back to taking more of a look at trace because they want to know, why haven't you done what I saw on TV? So if there's a good effect of the CSI effect, it is forcing us to look at those things that we used to look at long ago and kind of put away because of DNA. A good selling point that I have found with hair comparisons now is that we do mitochondrial also. The prosecutors, you're talking about, well, we've got this hair is consistent with the suspects, and their eyes kind of glaze over. And then you say, and we did mitochondrial DNA, and their eyes just sparkle. Their little eyes light right up when they hear that. They just can't wait to get to trial with that because it's DNA. Juries, they can't get enough of any kind of physical evidence. Where they used to fall asleep while you were describing, photographing the crime scene, now they're sitting there nodding their head because they saw that last week on the show. And Faye brought this up yesterday. We have to answer this question for juries. If you collected it, why didn't you analyze it? So we need to do a comprehensive examination of everything that comes before us. Okay, scenario number one, I'm going to run through this fast. I think I'm a little behind. This is the female victim found on the shoulder of the highway, partially clothed with possible sexual assault. Scene examinations, also known as whatever we can get away with, and here's why. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, I heard Faye yesterday talk about cutting clothes off a victim at a scene. I said, oh my God, we can't touch the body. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner sends out forensic investigators now, and they have an entire day of training before they become forensic investigators. And they basically say, don't do anything, wrap the body up, and we'll take it up to Baltimore, which I call a cesspool of contamination when it comes to trace evidence, because hairs everywhere from everybody. They do wipe the trays off on the gurneys with the same towel. So we're going to search the body with UV or alternate light sources, collect. This is if we can. This is if we can get away with it, if the forensic investigator allows us to do this. Collect extraneous hairs or fibers that we might find. We have a really non-intrusive way of latency from body. We use laminated glass transfer method. And if it's naked skin, nude skin, we will vacuum. I prefer that over tape lifts. Just vacuum the trace off. If we can, inkless fingerprints. It's really nice to know who the person is, not have to wait till the next day to the autopsy and bring the prints back and put them in the system. It's really nice to be able to do that at 3 in the afternoon and not have to wait till the next day. And we wrap the body in a sheet and then put it in the body bag, and we preserve that sheet later. And plenty of standards at that kind of crime scene, because you don't know what the suspects come in contact with, so soil, whatever is pertinent, we'll collect the standards. Autopsy exams, visible exam, ye old sexual assault kit, head and pubic hair combings. I wish we could do this at the scene, but we usually can't. It was certainly, especially head hair, would be much better to do at the scene rather than lose anything or have it contaminated. Fingernail scrapings, if we're not allowed to do that at the scene, which we're usually not. And collecting standards once again. Clothing of the victim, of course. And we collect the sheet that we wrap the victim in and preserve that for trace. The problem is you have to make sure what side is which, because the side that's on that dirty tray is going to have Caucasoid hair, Mongoloid hair, Negroid hair. I'll have a little bit of everything. Laboratory submissions for this scenario. Of course, the sexual assault kit and clothing goes to serology DNA. It's inherent in those kind of collections. Anything that is strictly for trace combings or extraneous collections, vacuumings, we'll send directly to a trace unit, to RJ Lee, with the victim's standards of pulled hair. And trace exams, investigative stuff, we just don't get this anymore. This ends up by the time we get to the point of identifying hairs and fibers that might give us some idea of the victim's environment perimortem, it's a cold case by that time because we're in the DNA backlog and we got the clothing submitted, and it takes forever to get that back. So it ends up we don't do this anymore where we have any information in a reasonable amount of time. It's always coming a year later, a year and a half later, and what good is it by then? It's probably greatly diminished its value. And of course, we eventually want to do all the comparative stuff, knowns and unknowns from the suspects. And again, we like to collect unknowns from suspects with any kind of recent arrest by using our suspect kits and penis swabs and all those kinds of things. Okay, I'm flying now because I'm behind. Scenario number 2, the vehicle recovered from a carjacking and then used in a robbery. Typical vehicle exams, usual search and processing for physical evidence. Collect hairs and fibers individually or vacuum or tape lift. It kind of depends on the condition of the car, how dirty it might be. And if it's been in shots fired, we do GSR collections from horizontal surfaces in the interior of the vehicle. Typical latent print stuff. We've got a policy now where we swab steering wheels rather than even try to find fingerprints because DNA works a lot better than trying to find a suitable print. Collect standards for the carpets and upholstery and all those sorts of things. And same with suspects, collection of knowns and unknowns. If we can get the clothing of the suspects that are a recent arrest, then we'll look for fibers and try to do a fiber comparison between the two. In conclusion, I'm flying now. What do I think we need, just from my standpoint as a little local guy? A more comprehensive training of serology DNA analysts. They're at the front line at a lot of crime labs. They're the ones that are looking at all this evidence, and they don't know a stinking thing about trace evidence. So they need to be trained better to recognize what is significant, to not only collect it, but to bring it to the attention of people who are going to have it examined by a trace evidence unit. The trend to shift back to the collection and analysis of trace evidence, and we do a really comprehensive collection, but we don't do a comprehensive examination because of the DNA backlog and all those other things I talked about. But what is driving us to do a better job with trace evidence? Juries. That's our ultimate audience, and they expect it, and you better offer it up. We're finally starting to realize there isn't DNA everywhere. Thank God. A good selling point for hair comparisons to kind of get prosecutors back into this is the mitochondrial DNA. Again, their little eyes will sparkle when you bring up DNA. And technological advances, a lot of stuff being presented this week. Technological advances that are going to make trace exams just generally more objective. I think that is a big selling point and will have us shifting back to doing more trace again. And I'm a little over, but thank you very much for your attention.